Well, as we wait for the numbers to tick slowly up, why don't we crack on with the introduction to this session, so we can really get into the meat of it. So, welcome to everyone here to the second THEHR webinar entitled Legal Hazards in MENA and COVID-19. I'm Nick Davis, the Hiring Solutions Director here at the Times Higher Education. A big thank you to everyone who's joined us today. We've had some really fantastic interest in this series so far, with hundreds of registrants from dozens of countries, both within the MENA region and beyond, which is great to see. This series, which includes last week's session that we held on faculty recruitment in MENA and COVID-19, and next week's session on onboarding during the pandemic, was imagined and brought to life through conversations that we held with our partners in the region back in March and April of this year, just as the global threat of COVID-19 became more and more apparent. So as universities started to shut their campuses, international students and faculty were looking to get flights back home, and senior leadership teams went into crisis planning. One burning question from our partners was what legal footfalls should they be looking out for in the human resource and recruitment space? What should employment contracts look like during and post the pandemic? What should universities and how should universities protect themselves and their staff through this period? And what would the sector look like after it was all over? We're a couple of months further along now, and hopefully a couple of months wiser. And to help answer some of these questions, we've managed to convene some, let's say, leading lights in the fields of legal and administration in HE in the region. I'll be quizzing them shortly, but we would love to get some questions from you guys in the audience as well. So please do use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen as well to ask your questions to the panel. And a quick plea from me, please send them throughout the session and we'll slot them in where we can. Please don't do as my editor did last week and send me a fantastic question with 2 minutes of the session left to go. It simply won't get read. So finally to my panelists, and firstly we have Susan Way, Director of Academic HR Affairs at NYU Abu Dhabi. Susan joined NYU Abu Dhabi in August of 2014 and has over 13 years of experience in human resources in the UAE. Prior to joining NYU Abu Dhabi, Susan was head of HR at University of Wollongong in Dubai for 4 years. Her past experience working as an HR consultant involved working with various industries, including but not limited to academic institutions, healthcare, security, pharmaceutical and aviation as well, including multiple startup organizations. In academia, she also has experience working with institutions to support accreditation in both programming and licensing. And since beginning her career, she had a broad generalist experience of HR, but latterly has worked the last 9 years on academic opportunities and appointments. So Susan, thank you so much and welcome. Next up, we have Dr. Hugh Martin, Registrar and Chief Administrative Officer at the British University in Dubai. Hugh graduated from the University of Oxford with a BA Hons and MA Hons in English Language and Literature, and after 7 years of working in the private sector, he decided, or I assume he missed academia just too much, and took on an MA in Creative Writing at the University of St Andrews. As an academic, Hugh has held the post of Associate Lecturer at the Open University for 15 years and has worked in higher education senior management for over 20 years, including University Secretary at the University of Birmingham, Chief of Staff at the London School of Economics, the Head of Governance at University of Bristol, and Executive Officer at University of St Andrews. Hugh, thanks so much for joining us. Last and by no means least, we have Ivor McGettigan, Partner and Chair of the Education Sector Group at Tamimi Company. Ivor chairs the firm's Education Sector Group and advises education providers throughout the Middle East on the full spectrum of legal issues arising from the sector. Ivor supports education providers on a wide range of issues, including employment, tenure, and academic freedom, drafting of policies, disciplinary procedures, rationalisation programmes and termination agreements. He has an appreciation of the unique demands of the sector and likes to focus on finding practical solutions for education providers. Ivor, pleasure to have you. And I'll turn to you first. We mentioned there in your intro that you like to focus on practical solutions, and in a time of crisis, pragmatism really is key. So how have universities responded to the pandemic, in your opinion? Have they been knocking down your door to get your advice?
Thank you, Nick, and it's a great honour to be joining this esteemed panel and to be talking to our audience today. Look, I think it's a very interesting question. I preface my answer by saying, for the audience members that may not be familiar with the Middle East, that we don't have, for example, the concept of tenure enshrined in legislation here, or we don't have any case law to suggest that it's a principle that's recognised here. I want to say here, I mean the Gulf region, but also the MENA region as well. They all have a very similar approach in relation to this concept. So the protections perhaps that employees would have in the UK, US and other jurisdictions as regards tenure don't really exist here. The reason I mention that at the outset is that I suppose the liability environment for the employer, for the university, is a very different kettle of fish to what it might be in other jurisdictions. Hence, people like Hugh, who have to make difficult decisions about hiring and firing, don't have to exercise the same amount of thought, perhaps, and worry than they might have to do back in a jurisdiction where tenure is recognised and where we have collective bargaining and trade unions. So from that point of view, coming back to your question, I think it's fair to say that my phone has been hopping more from the schools and the K-12 sector than it has been from the higher education sector. And I'm sure we'll touch on it shortly, but the higher education sector hasn't been as badly affected in the region as the K-12 sector. And there are a number of reasons for that, which I'm sure Hugh and Susan are better placed than me to talk about that. But what we are seeing is a consideration as to what kind of offers higher education institutions would like to make to incoming candidates. There hasn't been, in my experience, a huge amount of bloodletting or terminations. Obviously, there's always some in the natural way, but it hasn't been anything like the K-12 sector, which has been really badly hit in this particular region. So the questions we get asked from our clients is more about framing offers of employment to include conditionality in relation to the COVID-19. You know, whether the particular course will happen, whether the particular employee can get into the country. At the moment, in the Gulf region, it's not possible for a non-national to get a work permit until such time as this crisis passes. So a lot of our time was being spent on putting in what we call conditions precedent into employment contracts to cover off an eventuality where perhaps the course doesn't take place or the employee can't get in here. And we have some clients asking us to put in clauses around COVID-19. So, I mean, every lawyer in the world at the moment has dusted down their law books from first year university, and we all remember there was something about force majeure, wasn't there? And now of course we're all experts on it. But so we get a lot of queries from clients saying, "Oh, this is force majeure." I mean, everything's force majeure now. So we can rescind offers, we can get out of binding contracts. But I mean the reality is it's a difficult one to plead, and I don't want to go into the details and the long grass of force majeure. But basically, the concept is that it's an unknown risk or an unknown circumstance that's affected the contract, whereas COVID-19 has been known since January at the latest. So for new contracts of employment, we can't really put in a clause. A, it'd be very unusual to put in a force majeure clause in an employment contract. And B, we can't say, this is a force majeure clause. If COVID-19 affects your employment, we're not on the hook for anything. So that doesn't really work. But I'm conscious I've done a bit of a whistle-stop tour around a few topics there, Nick, but happy to dive in on anything further.
Well, we might come back to you and ask you the existential difference between the known and the unknown, and we can get into that debate later in the webinar. But Hugh, does that ring true for you then? Are those the kind of issues that you're facing at the British University of Dubai?
Yeah, just to add my thanks, like Ivor, to you all for joining this. I mean, Ivor's given a really good and comprehensive overview, and for any of our participants joining us from the MENA region, they'll know this, particularly in the GCC, that it's a very different ball game now. Susan is in a unique position, and she'll comment on that in terms of NYU and tenure. But for most of us at universities, and certainly the federal and government universities like mine, contracts are very, very different from anything you might have experienced before. Whether or not a contract is in place, everything is predicated on the basis of the residency visas, which staff need to have if they're not Emirati in the UAE, or if they're not Kuwaiti, Bahraini, Qatari, Omani, or Saudi in their own countries. So the majority of us will be on a residency visa of, say, 3 years. So actually, the legal contract you might have to come here, I don't want to say it's irrelevant, but it's overshadowed all the time by the fact that your residency visa is the most important thing you have. And that is what decides how we hire and fire staff. So in most cases, in my university, if we go to that one, we issue open-ended contracts to academics and to administrative staff in the main. We have had some discussions, interestingly, around COVID-19 and shorter-term contracts. But if they're coming in from outside the UAE, and that will be after the restrictions are lifted, I'm actually not going to see any major change, not in terms of the legal setup of the contract. Where I'm going to see changes, as Ivor mentioned, are going to be around the nervousness, anxieties, reassurances needed by staff coming in about the environment they're coming to, the safety and otherwise. And I certainly, in this climate, don't want to appear complacent, but I think, you know, hats off to the UAE government. I think GCC, other countries have similar experiences. We have been looked after incredibly well. We have had, procedures put in place very early on in terms of the pandemic. And our numbers, although tragic numbers of deaths are there, they're significantly lower than those of us that come from Europe or from the States and from Australasia. So, you know, this is a relatively safe environment in terms of staff wanting to come here. Practically and logistically, getting here is another question, and I'm sure we'll come on to that later in this discussion.
And Susan, I know you'll want to talk about again about the region and how it's been dealt with, but if you could quickly just explain the differences as Hugh's mentioned, and the position that NYU Abu Dhabi is in at the moment.
Yeah, sure. I mean, for NYU Abu Dhabi, we are very much part of the Global Network and part of the mother enterprise, which is NYU in New York. And so even though we have our, the campus here is a portal campus, in terms of faculty appointment, they're very much governed by the NYU faculty handbook. And so that's very much the same for faculty who are hired in New York. And therefore, we do have the different type of contracts, including tenure track faculty who are on a 6-year probationary period, essentially. And we have people, tenure track faculty who are currently in that probationary period. So from a legal standpoint, the tricky part for us is, and the liability is to be able to extend that tenure, that probationary period by another year because of COVID-19, right? So that's for those that are here. In terms of those that are tenure, we offer tenure, but at the same time, very much like what Hugh says, it's still, there's the side element to it, which is people are, and faculty and staff are still governed by the UAE labor law. So, for us, that's kind of a secondary thing that they don't necessarily, they do not at all determine the faith of whether, one would continue or not. But that's obviously, there's the sense of continuous uncertainty that, I have tenure here at NYU Abu Dhabi, but, can I live here, for as long as I can? The complication for us is really more about new joiners, and I think we'll talk a little bit about that, which is, we normally conclude our recruitment efforts around the spring period, so anything between February up until now, right? So, I think Ivor had talked about maybe retracting offers. That could be one risk, but then the other risk associated with that is reputational risk, right? And so, fortunately or unfortunate for NYU Abu Dhabi, we're still in a growth stage, so we're still not in a position where we said, okay, we need start withdrawing offers. However, trying to honor these contracts, even though we want to honor these contracts, how do we do that, right? And the complication between and the priority with the academic mission, and also the continuation of teaching, which is going to continue in the fall, but not being able to onboard them. That is, I think, for the most part of us, trying to figure out how we're going to navigate through that, which is, if people are going to be teaching remotely, how do we pay them remotely, given that we're not able to onboard them, and their visas are still not being issued in the UAE.
And I suppose that rings true, Hugh. You mentioned that we might see more short-term or visiting lecturer contracts coming into force. What's that going to look like over the next year or so?
Interesting. Actually, what we might see, I mean, contracts aside, in terms of the short term and the visiting point you just mentioned, Nick, we're already seeing this actually. The British University in Dubai is partnered with 3 large Russell Group universities in the UK, Glasgow, Edinburgh and Manchester. And we've been working with them for 15 years since we started, but we're having discussions now, which are definitely have been raised by COVID-19, around more online sharing, more interdisciplinarity between our academics and theirs. Now, we were doing that already, but, traveling out to Dubai, traveling to Scotland, it was the kind of usual way of academia. Now we're talking about a lot more, having things legally written down in terms of their academics providing some work for us and vice versa. And this goes beyond just mutual research. This leads into teaching. So there does need to be a little bit of a contractual element. So yeah, I think we're going to see some creative solutions to what we're facing. To be honest, without blowing all of our own trumpet in the HE sector, we've been seeing creative solutions. I think this, Nick, and times higher definitely, around the whole pandemic. The fact that universities have never been more vital, not just in the research they're doing behind the scenes to try and find vaccines and find solutions, but also the distance learning that most of us have had to switch to very, very quickly. The fact that we're supporting staff in very unusual situations. Some of us have staff, for example, out of country right now that can't come back. We're out and couldn't come back anyway. We're used to this in some ways. We're international bodies. As Susan quite rightly said, NYU is a global brand. So, we're used to that level. Where we're going to be more imaginative will be, having to, for example, practical example, we have appointed some staff to start here in Dubai at the British University in September. Likelihood is they may not be able to arrive. As Ivor said, the visas may not be issued. So we're looking at starting them, onboarding them, to use the term, virtually. They will start, we will do with all their induction and everything. My HR team will deal with that, possibly from their home in the UK or in Australia.
Right. I mean, it's a fascinating situation we're going to find ourselves in come September. Susan, we had a brief chat yesterday, and Hugh's actually mentioned it there at the top of the conversation about how the UAE and really how the Gulf has dealt with the COVID pandemic and dealt with it in a very proactive and in a really good way, especially when you compare it to some other countries. I'm thinking of myself here in the UK and the US as well. You think that there could be a real benefit for the region from the way it's been dealt with in terms of reputation and in terms of recruitment?
Yeah, I certainly do think so. I mean, for a clear example is how we handle, and if we look at the trends in higher education, particularly undergraduate colleges and universities around the world where there is boarding, and for the most majority, they've kind of been trying to get students to go home, right, during this whole pandemic because of the risk and liability associated with that. For NYU Abu Dhabi, we've made a commitment to all of our community members, so from faculty, students, staff, that if they're unable to go home and they prefer to stay here, then they can do so. And that is for the most part, our students continue to want to stay here all throughout the summer as well, in order for them to be able to be here on campus, because they do feel safer here than they would back home, wherever that is, right? Currently, our student bodies represent about 115 countries, and our faculty body represent 45 countries. And they do feel that the government here has responded quite well.
And Ivor, does that ring true for you as well in the, you know, I suppose slightly outside of the HE sector? Do you think that we're going to see a bit of a boom for businesses and universities out in the Gulf and the wider MENA region?
Yeah, look, I think anecdotally what we're hearing is that a lot of families are expat families, maybe traditionally would have sent their children, more likely to send them to the UK, back to the mothership. At the moment, they're more likely to send them into local institutions and into local universities. Likewise, you know, you look at Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia send at any one time 80 to 100,000 students to mainly to the United States, but also to the UK. And again, you know, you would look at that now and think, well, a lot of those families would prefer to have their children at home. So it's definitely going to have an impact, I think. So that's a differentiator about from HE, from the K-12 sector, because that's not something in the K-12 sector. There's more supply and more competition, so it's quite a negative story. Whereas in HE, the competition really was the universities abroad, which are less attractive now.
Do you think we'll see that with the local population as well? You say that the expat population won't be sending their children abroad. Would the same be true for local Emiratis or local Saudis as well?
Yeah, I mean, interesting question, because a lot of local students wouldn't consider going abroad. There's two sides to it. In order to get a job in the civil service or in a government job in the UAE, for example, and similar in the other countries as well, similar in Saudi Arabia, you need to have a degree from a local university, which is a federally or emirate level funded university, or one that's recognized, and there's a particular list of universities. So, I mean, if you go to one of the top universities in UK or US, that'll certainly be on the list. But if it's not on that list, then, and if that particular candidate has a desire to work not in the private sector, then they will be naturally tending to go to a local university. And I would stress, people outside the region underestimate. I mean, that sounds like an archaic thing that I'm saying. I can't imagine a student in the UK at 18 years old thinking, I would like to work in the public sector. I need to go to this university. It wouldn't even enter the consciousness. But in this particular region, and particularly the UAE, you know, we're in a country where 85% of the population are non-resident. We're in a country where the private sector is 90 to 95% non-national. We're in a country where the government and civil service is 95% national. So for them, it's a completely different equation, and for a lot of young people, and particularly the parents, it's important to mention, parents are a key component in particularly this region in their children's choice of higher education venue. And traditionally, since the 1970s onwards, the view has been for locals, you know, and this is a broad generalization, of course, but the view has been a job in the government is a good job. It's safe, it's dependable. You're putting something back into your own country. So it would be a consideration in university choice. Obviously, for some candidates who, you know, your straight A physics, maths candidate, that's you know, not relevant to them. They're still going to go to whatever universities meets their requirements. And but I'm talking about the broad swath in the middle, who certainly would be very much prejudiced towards going to a local university or one of the top ones internationally, but nothing in between, basically.
Right. Hugh, you're nodding away there. Does that sound about right to you?
Yeah, it does. I mean, there are two interesting sides to this part about one about student recruitment, actually then coming back to this topic about staff recruitment, actually, in terms of local stuff. So, for example, at the British University, Ivor mentioned we're not federal, but we're an emirate funded, so we're government of Dubai. And about a third of our students are Emirati. And those Emirati students actually have the choice within the UAE, it's similar in other GCC countries, to go to their own universities, their federal universities, for free. So now we do charge fees, we're non-for-profit, but they do have to pay to come to our university. So this issue around whether this will really change much in COVID is probably moot. Ivor's quite right, of course, there's a small top level as there is in any country of university students good enough to go to the Oxfords, the Cambridges, the NYUs, the Yales, and they will go anyway, travel allowing. But within one of my, I think, queries now, as we're talking about legal hazards, is not so much to do with keeping Emirati students, but actually is around recruiting Emirati staff. Because within this country, and again, similar in our neighboring countries, certainly in Saudi, we have something called Emiratization, which is the requirement, national requirement, to have a certain percentage of our staff of Emiratis. And that is particularly hard in most sectors, but very hard in academia, where there are just simply not the numbers of Emirati academics. Now, in my little university, we have a selection of Emirati academics, which is great. Trained, however, internationally, trained at top universities in Atlanta, in Manchester in the UK, in Australia. So these are, have been to top universities where they have the accredited degrees. This is going to be actually a risk now, given that trying to get Emirati staff to meet our Emiratization targets, but also because staff will not be traveling out of the Gulf region in the same way that, new academics used to. I'm just thinking, I mean, this is a few years ahead, but I'm thinking of this, we've talked a little bit about the dangers of COVID. There's also, dare I say, a COVID dividend, which is that in this region, we might pick up more students. Ivor's mentioned expat children who ordinarily might have gone home to the US, to Europe, to UK, and are probably going to stay here. There's also students from the Far East, a big market in India and China, who would ordinarily have gone to those top universities, but may be saying, hang on a minute, why do I want to travel all the way, even if it's safe to? If I go all the way to, say, UK, and then I've got to stay in a student room and be on my laptop, I might as well go somewhere else. And then Dubai, particularly, and the UAE has this dividend of saying, well, we are open for business. This is an education hub. It's also, by the way, a transport hub. If our universities can start producing top quality education quickly for them, there's no reason why they shouldn't come here. So there's a little bit of a give and take, perhaps a dividend in terms of recruiting students, perhaps a risk in how we're going to make sure the next generation of Emirati academics, which most of us are desperate to see. We're always feeling a bit uncomfortable as we're guests in this country, very privileged to be here, very lucky to help run universities here. But at the same time, we need the Emirati academics, Emirati senior staff to come through to take those positions.
Well, that was certainly our immediate knee-jerk reaction, I think, when COVID was kicking off, and we thought, well, is this a chance for countries with these national agendas to really push forward, start training some of their young budding academics and get them into the system. But it's interesting to hear that actually it could have that dual purpose of, yes, trying to meet some Emiratization or some Saudization targets, but also attracting markets that will be turned off from other parts of the world. Susan, is that something that you think you're going to see?
Yeah, I mean, I probably will be able to answer this more specifically by next week, but NYU has launched this thing called Go Local for our students, whereby, the students that are currently enrolled in any of the campuses can apply to take the courses from campuses where they have residency. So they have access, essentially, if we have Emirati students who are currently enrolled in NYU Shanghai or in NYU New York, for example, or any of the other 14 sites, then they may request to take the course in Abu Dhabi over the fall. So, I think that'll be interesting to see the numbers, because obviously we track the number of students, Emirati students who are registered and enrolled in NYU Abu Dhabi, but not necessarily in the other campuses. Yeah, but I imagine that it would have, it'll be for them and for the parents as well. I think they'd feel a lot more comfortable being here than in New York at the moment.
I think we all would, certainly. We've got our first question from the floor, and please do send through your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom. This question comes from Sidra Shaheen. Is it legal in the UAE to onboard staff virtually if there is no work permits issued? As at the moment, we are waiting for news related to work permit issuance. Hugh, I might turn to you then, and then Ivor after.
Yeah, you may want. I mean, obviously, Ivor's the lawyer in the room, so he will have much better intel than me. I mean, I'm gonna, like a typical academic in a way, I'm gonna quibble a little bit over the wording. So there's the issue of onboarding someone and getting them firmly into your, salaried work permit situation, which is of course a legal situation. But academics and academia in general, we've always been very clever. I'm using that word carefully with a lawyer here. We've been very clever at working with people overseas. You know, for example, we have external examiners in my university because we use the British system for primarily a postgraduate institution for postgraduate degrees. And for every PhD, we have an external examiner from the UK or US or from an esteemed university. So, and they're paid to do that. That's the norm. But that doesn't mean we have to onboard them within the UAE. They're not salary, you know. So there are ways around it. And in our particular case, we will clearly follow whatever the law says. But in terms of the members of staff who will start in September, if they are unable to come physically to do the visa permit process that's required for all of us here, we will have other ways of enabling them to start with VUID, and that is to start teaching, the critical part, and their research, which is ongoing. But they'll do that in their home country, and we'll then worry about the work permit situation, which applies in country later on. But I'm waiting for Ivor to suddenly tell me that what I've suggested is highly illegal.
Please, Ivor, don't call the police. Let's not have you arrested. Just give us the nuts and bolts of that answer, if you would.
Well, I know where Hugh lives, so the police might just be knocking on the door very shortly here. But no. In order to get a UAE visa, well, currently, as I said earlier, work visas are not being issued at the moment, so it's not possible to onboard new staff in the sense of physically getting them a visa at the moment. And the system, as we understand it, was currently in freeze frame. But when it does start again, we don't envisage any change to the system. And basically, the system is such that you get what we call an entry permit issued as an initial document. And when that person then arrives in the UAE, in Abu Dhabi airport or Dubai airport, a clock starts ticking. So it's registered that they've arrived in the country, and then they have to complete the entry permit. It's just a first step in the process. Then they have to complete the visa process. And one of them, there's two, without boring you with the details, but there's two steps. One is getting your fingerprints and all your sort of ID stuff registered on the network, and then secondly, a medical examination to ensure, interestingly enough, that you're not carrying any contagious diseases. That was pre-COVID-19, but obviously that's going to be even more important now. So there's a particular process that takes place that can't be done virtually, and there's no indication that that's going to change. In fact, I think they'll double down on that system at the moment, given the pandemic.
We seem to be coming back time and again to kind of duration of visa and the huge role that this plays in your ability to be employed within the UAE. We had a chat yesterday, and there was mentioned that the idea of a longer visa had been proposed or had been discussed. And Susan, I think you had some experience of this. Could you talk us through that?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, the UAE has been, or they've started the initiative of different type of longer term visas. I think it's called the Golden Visa. That's one of it. And then they've got a 5-year and a 10-year visa. And then the Golden Visa is kind of like the cherry on the cake. So we have, in terms of the eligibility and criteria, it's meant to cover specifically. What's interesting for us is that it covers researchers, scientists, and also artistic scholars. So, this is well received by the community. We haven't yet seen the bulk on how this is going to be implemented, but we did have one faculty member who was granted through the government, was granted this 10-year visa. So that's not at all, him and his family are not sponsored by the university anymore. They're sponsored directly by the government, and they're kind of on their own visa, which is a 10-year visa. So something for us to look forward to.
Hugh, is that something you're going to be pushing for? Are you going to be looking to get as many of your academics as possible onto 10-year visas?
I would love that to happen, but I think it's worth pointing out that these 10-year visas, these golden visas, they have certain words for them. I mean, they are extremely rare. They are given as gifts, if you like, in recognition of extraordinary achievement in various fields. There have been a few in education, but very few. I read in the papers just before the COVID lockdown started of a couple of K-12 school teachers getting these visas, so it's very rare. But then the majority that I've found have been given to business people who have either made a lot of money here, invested a lot of money here. It's understandable, but I honestly am not looking at this being a huge impact on the HE sector, because you know, if you start giving them out to everyone, they cease to, you know, the common cliche, they cease to be golden anymore. And you know, it may well be that times will change, and then people keep talking about this new normal. It's not a phrase I like, but that things will move on, and that you know, governments like the UAE and elsewhere will look at their visa all round and decide maybe longer visas would give them more stability. You know, there's a lot of movement of people within the UAE. Ivor's already attested to the numbers of non-local or non-Emirati people that reside here. So, you know, these could be conversations happening at a higher level. If so, then HE's put in will be very much, we would prefer longer visas, because then we could move to a system like NYU and others. We're not a branch campus, so we haven't got that mothership to rely on. But certainly, if it would give so much more job security, and ultimately all of us require job security. Academics, senior staff, all of my admin teams, you know, nobody wants to be looking over their shoulder all the time thinking, no matter how good your performance or poor, that you're really, it's what's in your passport that counts. It should be about longer term planning, about thinking about your family, your kids, maybe studying here yourself, all those things which we are able to do in other environments where we're not looking at our passport.
Ivor, you were coming in there with something.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Just to add to what Susan and Hugh have said, other Gulf countries have also have had similar initiatives. You know, Saudi Arabia announced a similar type of program not so long ago. I don't know how anybody received any visas yet under it, but you know, so I think we're getting similar noises around the region, and I think there's perhaps an acknowledgement that in certain sectors to attract, you know, the cream of the crop, the existing system, particularly when you look at tenure, the existing system needs to be tweaked a little bit. But just to add another point, although the visas are 2 to 3 year visas, generally speaking, for the non-golden visas, the contracts don't have to sync with the visas. So, you know, some institutions issue what we call limited term contracts that sync exactly with the visa, but then other institutions have an indefinite term contract. So it doesn't have to sync. And if it went to the local courts, the whole visa scenario doesn't really come into it. I mean, local courts will say, well, that's interesting, but that's an immigration matter. And you've come here to deal with a contractual matter, and we need to look at the contract. And we've seen cases where, you know, the employer may try and use the visa as a baton to beat down the plaintiff, but the courts here don't really buy that. The courts here are quite pro-employee, and when I say here, I mean the entire region. It might be surprising to some of the listeners, but the courts are extremely sympathetic to employees. So the court wouldn't get hung up on the visa side of things, generally speaking.
And just on that idea of job security, and again, we were discussing this yesterday, there used to be a bit of a safety net for a lot of academics in their contracts being a very long notice period. In some cases up to a year, I think. That's been trimmed down now, right? So we're down to about 3 months. And the question is, are we going to see other measures coming into academic contracts in a similar way that we do in the private sector, in terms of large sign-on bonuses and things like this, to attract, but also give people a bit of security? And even if it does go all wrong, well, then I'm going to be taken care of. Yeah,
look, firstly, in relation to the notice period, very common to have a 1 year notice period for a senior academic or any teaching faculty, on the basis that if they leave mid-academic year, it's an absolute nightmare for the institution to try and carry on that course. The UAE brought in this particular change, not the other countries, in relation to the notice period. And frankly, you know, it wasn't intended to focus at HE, this is just an unintended consequence, unfortunately. In fact, it was brought in for good reasons and noble intentions, but it sort of backfired a little bit because it doesn't necessarily suit HE, this particular thing. But on the sign-on bonuses, we've definitely seen over the years for top faculty that the institution's really keen to get their hands on, who perhaps is leaving a tenured position. in their negotiations with the institution, this particular candidate, he or she is saying, I'm walking away from a sure thing, and I need guarantees. So then there is talk of built-in contractual sign-on bonus or other type of benefit that could be triggered in a termination scenario, maybe in the first 1 year or the first 18 months or whatever. So that's definitely not uncommon, but I would just caveat that by saying for senior or well-established people, I think for junior academics, we wouldn't see it.
Hugh, you're not going to be rushing to amend your contracts and put in extra clauses to take care of incoming faculty.
Not necessarily, but I mean, just thinking while Ivor was saying that he was talking about financial benefits. Of course, there are other benefits that can and are used by employers here. I mean, most of us, look, we come in with our eyes open. I've been here just a couple of years, so I'm relatively new, but exactly as Ivor said, if you're leaving a senior position in the sector, in the UK, US, Australia, wherever it's got a mature sector, you're leaving behind a very well networked, very well sewn up system that's been around for, in some cases, many hundreds of years. And you're coming to a younger, slightly perhaps less mature system without those networks, without trades unions, for example, without associations and bodies of representatives, because lobbying is not, it's frowned upon here. So one thing we do, I'll give you an example of tangible benefits that we can give. For our academic staff who are giving up some of that perhaps, we make it really, it's part of our USP as a research institution, a heavy research institution, that we will fund a lot more overseas conferences for them than perhaps they would used to have in their home institution, where they would have to look for funding and they still have to make a case. It's not a freebie. There has to be a Q1 paper coming out of it. There have to be, important academic benefits. But this is about keeping them in touch with those communities, because we are, we might be a global hub in terms of transport, and we could become an educational hub, which I know the UAE Ministry of Education here would very much like. But we can become isolated if we're not careful. Personally, I have the same. I belong to the Association of Heads of University Administrators, which is the body for all COOs, Deputy Vice Chancellors in the UK and Ireland. And I'm the only international member, and I fought very hard for that. And that's a personal example of keeping in touch with those colleagues that I can then call, video with, just make sure I've still got my finger on the pulse. And the same exists with Australian colleagues, with American colleagues, and with colleagues of Humane, which is the European Association of COOs and registrars. And so these are, other benefits you can wrap into contracts alongside, your travel ticket, which everyone expects, their annual flights, the web, the medical insurance, the school fees, all the things that people look for. These are, I think, important for academics particularly. It's about that, you might be coming to Dubai, you might be coming to Abu Dhabi, but we are an international academic community. And I'm sure in Susan's case, because you've got a fantastic name like NYU behind you, it's a little bit easier. But for some institutions out here, it's about really holding on to the value of the international network.
Susan, I'm sure it's not all that easy. I'm sure Hugh's making your job sound a lot easier than it really is. Apart from your stunning campus, which I admitted earlier on to taking some really awkward selfies on last time I was there, what else are you offering in those packages in line with what Hugh's talking about there?
Yeah, well, actually, just to that point, our challenges was the reverse, actually, in the beginning, because we have this brand, right? So a lot of people, the impression is, okay, if I get a job at NYU Abu Dhabi, does that mean I get a job at NYU? Can I transfer to NYU, right? So then having to try and convince people to say that actually, no, the hire is really in Abu Dhabi, and that it's, if it's a 10-year position or a permanent position, it's a permanent position at NYU Abu Dhabi. So, we've had to adopt similar strategies to what Hugh have just mentioned. Again, as given that we're also a research university, it's, looking at what are the premiums and opportunities that we can provide to these senior faculty in order for them to relocate from, a very established sector in wherever they're from to come here, right? But I do have to say, I think, as we mature and as the country matures as well, people are now starting to see it differently. I think they see that, and again, Hugh, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm starting to sense that, with research now, moving towards different parts of the world, not just in North America. A lot of people actually do have a genuine interest of being here, right? So if we talk about, studies on gender, there's been a lot of studies of gender in North America, but now we're seeing that there's been a lot of North American faculty who are interested in the studies of gender in the Middle East or in, the subcontinent. And being here in Abu Dhabi is actually far more ideal than if they were back in the US. So I see that as a good opportunity, probably more in the long term, but we clearly are seeing some start of the trend in this growing interest of being here in this region.
Brilliant. I mean, it does sound like what is going to be a very tricky time for a lot of sectors. Could be a really positive one for the UAE. Now, I'm about to take us on a little bit of a tangent, and before I do, I'm going to throw a plea out to the audience again. Please do send through some questions. We've got just over 10 minutes left. We'd love to get some of those questions to the panel. That tangent I'm talking about, and Susan, I'm going to come straight back to you on this one. This isn't an outcome in any way of the pandemic, but I think it's something that's going to be forever intrinsically linked with it. And it's the Black Lives Matter movement that started off in the US and has, really made waves worldwide. Do you think we're going to see an impact in terms of equality and diversity, either movements within universities or actually coming down into the contracts for universities? Are we going to see impact in the UAE and the wider MENA region?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we've been working, very hard over the last couple of years in terms of trying to diversify our faculty body and our staff as well. I've shared with you the numbers on students, right? We have 115 countries and only 15% are from the UAE, right? So these 115 represent the 114 countries. So from a student's point of view, they want to see that representation. They want to be able to, representation not only in terms of identity, but in terms of academic background as well and research, right? So as we're thinking about diversity and as we're thinking about Black Lives Matters, we're thinking about, well, how can we strategically make sure that that's inclusive and as part of our strategy to make sure that there's real representation and support for particularly the Black community, and also the way that our students see themselves, that they need to be represented.
Hugh, you're nodding away there. Is that a similar perspective for you?
I know it strays a little bit from the idea of legal hazards around recruitment, but it's so important that Susan's mentioned this. If we look at we're very similar actually, even though we're a much smaller university, we have about 48 nationalities represented. So, and about a third Emirati, a third from the wider Arab-speaking world, and then a third other, if you like. But, let's be really clear here. This is the student experience that many of us enjoyed when we were undergraduates of coming to university. And that's going to be very challenged in this pandemic world. But the student experience of going to somewhere where you meet people of different backgrounds, of different cultures, of different religions, of different genders, of different sexualities. That's the whole point for me. That's why I'm in higher education. That's the point of a university education. It tends to happen best on campus. Of course, we are having to deal with the situation we're in, and blended learning may give us a bit of both, thank goodness. But that has to be mirrored in your faculty. So although, I'm really lucky, Susan's really lucky to have a diverse student body. Colleagues, Mohammed Salam would say the same at University of Wollongong, for example, here in Dubai, I know very diverse. But amongst faculty, it's a problem. It's not just a problem of people of color, it's really a problem with getting more female academics represented and female staff at more senior levels. So while the administration of my university has a good gender balance, we don't find the same in our senior staff. And that is an issue. And, we need to be clear about that. There's obviously rules and regulations about working within the countries we find ourselves, and we must obey those, and that's obvious. We're guests here. At the same time, universities have always been places of debate and challenge. That's why we exist. We do research, we find answers, we challenge the boundaries of knowledge. And that happens both within our staff and student bodies too. So to be properly representative and to be leading academic institutions, we need the diversity of the institutions that we would find in a New York or a London or a Sydney or a Paris. So these are problematic questions for those of us who are looking at hiring, because we're those people who are willing to come out here and who are willing to study and work here. it's a smaller pot perhaps than we might have been faced in our own institutions back home.
I think, I'm sure there's nobody here that would disagree with the sentiment there, and it's fantastic to hear that at a university level there is a lot being done at both NYU Abu Dhabi and the British University of Dubai. But from my perspective, at least, a lot of this has to be driven by law at a government level, at a regional level as well, and that's certainly the case here in the UK. Ivor, a perhaps incendiary question to you. Do you think we'll see any legal changes, any almost constitutional changes within the region as to the Black Lives Matter movement?
Well, look, to look at the current legislation in the region, broadly speaking, there are no anti-discrimination laws within the employment sphere. Essentially, I mean, there are one or two laws that some people have purported to be anti-discrimination laws for employment, but they're not really. They're anti-discrimination laws in relation to hate crime and hate speech, but they're not sophisticated or specific about hiring people of diversity or the criteria for hiring or who's the comparator, all the type of stuff you would see in the UK and you would see mentioned from any discrimination claim. We do have a number of enclaves, if you wish, in the region that are subject to common law, and they do have anti-discrimination legislation, but none of the large universities are in those areas. So what you find is that employers have decided themselves that they're going to legislate themselves for this. So, in fact, when you look at our clients and Hugh and Susan are clearly doing this as well, they've mentioned this as well, they say, you know what, we're going to bring in a policy that's going to demand diversity and have zero tolerance on any form of discrimination. So it's brought in our experience, that's how it's brought into the region. And, if you look at multinational companies, they generally hark back to the mothership and bring their policies into this region to the extent that they can and that they fit. So generally what we're seeing is the larger and reputable employers and throughout HE are doing this themselves. And it's not been legislation driven. So, and in fact, there are some salutary tales for institutions or employers who haven't done this or who have been viewed internationally as being dragging their feet on some of these topics. They've been subject to various social media campaigns and boycotts and everything else, which is incredibly effective from the to achieve goals, and perhaps maybe more effective than voicing the concerns locally. But I can't answer the second part of the question, which is the difficult part about is there likely to be legislation in the region here. Just it's not a criticism. It's just a different system. In the UK, a piece of legislation goes through the particular pipeline, a white paper, green paper, through the House of Parliament and various committees, and legislation generally goes through a pipeline, could take 18, 24 months. In this part of the world, that doesn't happen in that way. It does go through a pipeline, but it's not a pipeline that stakeholders are generally privy to. They can be at a very high level, but it's not something that's publicly available. So for all I know, there could be legislation on the statute books, but it hasn't seen the light of day yet, and you generally don't know until it's just about to be issued. So I can't really answer on that, I'm afraid.
Yeah,
I appreciate it.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. I mean, I think it's got to go beyond legislation, right? Because, I memean, we have, countries that have these legislations in place. And, if I compare ourselves to NYU in New York, it's still a struggle, right? So I think it's got to be intentional, and it requires retraining of everybody. This movement, particularly Black Lives Movement, and prior to that, the Me Too movement for gender equality, is that it has allowed all of us to kind of reopen history and relearn what we need to learn, right? And be able to move forward. So I think, legislation, yes, that's important, but I do think that you know, this is much bigger than that. And it takes every single one of us within our own scope of work and personal responsibilities as well to be able to make these changes. And again, particularly in higher education, you know, we've got to make sure that our students are represented, right? And our students come from all parts of the world with different backgrounds, different profile, different, you know, ways on how they identify themselves. And they need to have that, that ability to be able to see that, okay, you know, as I'm maturing and I'm coming into this real world, you know, I can associate myself with Professor X or with this person. And that will help them to prepare themselves into the real world, right?
That's a really quick point to add to, because for that, Nick, I totally agree with what Susan said. For me, legislation, of course, is important, but this is, let's be honest, this is going to be driven by students. I don't see students as consumers, by the way. I left the retail world a long time ago, but students have an awful lot of power. It was students who pulled down the Rhodes statue in Oriel College at Oxford. It's students that pulled down Colston statue in Bristol. You know, and this is back in the UK, where people like to think representation is a lot more easy. You know, students will vote with their feet. They don't need a lot of white middle-aged men like me mansplaining things to them. This is one of the problems with the system out here in terms of academics. It tends to be white middle-aged men. But students represent a much wider and much more diverse community, and they will push for this, whether we have the legislation or not. And sometimes that groundswell of movement is actually more effective than just a law on statute.
I think that's a, you know, a fantastic point and a great one to bring this to a close on. And in fact, you know, we're looking at a series focused on EDI in UK universities coming up later this year. And a lot of the conversation is saying, well, okay, we saw this legislation come in a decade, 2 decades ago. We've gone through the process of writing out our, you know, our memorandums. We've got the badges that say we're part of the right processes. But actually, what's changed? What have we really done? And it's almost now moving past the rhetoric and moving past the what are we doing on paper to actually forcing through a real change. So it's very interesting to hear you say that. We've run out of time. All that is left to say really is, firstly, everyone who joined the session, thank you so much for coming on and listening to us talk. I hope you found something to take away from the conversation. Please do also join us for next week's session, which is the same time next Wednesday, on onboarding into the pandemic. And all that is left to say is thank you so much to Hugh, Ivor and Susan for your contributions. Thank you.